The morning mist still clung to the narrow street when the girl appeared at the curb. 9 years old. School uniform faded but pressed. Backpack straps twisted so tight in her fists her knuckles had gone bone white. Behind her, the low hum of early traffic. In front of her, 3 black sedans parked like sleeping predators. And standing between them, the man her mother had forbidden her to even look at. Chairman Kong. They didn't call him a mafia boss in this district. They called him the Wall. Whatever struck him stopped there. Whatever crossed him vanished. The Korean underworld moved around him the way water moves around stone. Carefully, quietly, with respect that bordered on terror. He was stepping out of his car when she spoke. "Mister, can you walk me to school today?" The air crystallized. Every suited guard behind him went rigid. One man's hand twitched toward his jacket. Another's eyes swept the street, searching for threats. Because this didn't happen. No one approached Kong Sung-ho without clearance. Not rival organizations. Not politicians. And certainly not children who should have been invisible. Kong turned slowly and crouched until their eyes met. Up close, his face told stories his mouth never would. Silver threading through dark hair pulled back tight. Scars cutting across his jaw like punctuation marks on a violent sentence. His eyes weren't cruel. They were alert. Calculating. Watching. Why? His voice was quiet. Controlled. The girl's throat worked as she swallowed. Because if I walk alone he follows me. She didn't point. She didn't need to. Across the street, half hidden by a delivery truck, a man leaned against a lamppost. Phone in hand, but his eyes weren't on the screen. Kong recognized the posture instantly. The false casualness, the predatory patience. Not a local. Not a worker. A watcher. The girl's voice shook but didn't break. My mom says I shouldn't talk to you. But I don't know who else to ask. Behind them, a woman burst through the apartment complex door. Yuna. Mrs. Park, still in her cleaning uniform, hair half-pinned, panic carved into every line of her face, stopped dead when she saw where her daughter stood. I'm so sorry, she bowed again and again. She didn't mean to, please forgive us. Kong raised one hand. Instant silence. He looked back at the child. What's your name? Yuna Park. I'm 9. How long has he been following you? Almost 2 weeks. Mrs. Park's breath caught audibly. Yuna. He waits by the bakery, Yuna continued, her voice steadier now. Sometimes near the school gate. He knows my name. That was all Kong needed to hear. He stood. Every man behind him straightened in perfect unison. Get my jacket, Kong said, his tone flat and absolute. His head of security blinked. Sir. I'm walking her to school. Across the street, the watcher's body language shifted. A subtle stiffening, a recalculation of threat. And just like that, Chairman Kong shattered the unspoken rule between power and invisibility, between the underworld and the ordinary, and set in motion a chain of events that would force him to choose between the empire he'd built and the one thing he thought he'd buried years ago. His conscience. Stay until the end, because what happens when a mafia boss becomes a little girl's protector will redefine everything you think you know about power, fear, and the debts we can never repay. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now let's dive in. Her name was Yuna Park, 9 years old, daughter of Mrs. Park, who'd cleaned floors in buildings owned by Kang's shell companies for 6 years. Hello my friends. Thanks for joining me on this fascinating story. Before we continue, please kindly help subscribe to the channel, like the video and comment where you are watching from, and what time it's at your end. Now let's continue with our story. What Kong didn't tell her was that nice wasn't something he'd been in a very long time. The city knew him as a king without mercy, a man who built an empire on fear and absolute control. But before the empire, before the scars and the reputation that made grown men lower their eyes, before all of that, there was a boy who couldn't save his sister. And now, looking at Yuna's hopeful eyes, Kong realized something that would change everything. Some debts can't be settled with money or power. Some debts require you to become someone different entirely. Yuna lived in the building behind Chairman Kang's private gym, staff housing owned by one of his shell companies. Her mother scrubbed floors, polished mirrors, and kept her eyes down. In their world, survival meant invisibility. The philosophy was taught early and reinforced daily. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make eye contact with the guests. Don't ask questions about what you see. Be grateful for what you have, because people like us don't get second chances. Mrs. Park worked 12-hour days keeping Kang's properties pristine. She polished marble floors worth more than a year of her salary. She arranged flowers in vases that cost more than her monthly rent. She served people who never learned her name. The staff quarters were clean but stark, where the luxury ended at a very clear line. Simple tile replaced marble. Basic bulbs replaced chandeliers. The message was architectural. You belong here, not there. For 3 weeks, Yuna had been telling her mother about the man. The one who waited near the school gates every morning. The one who followed her down the 6 blocks between the estate and her elementary school. The one who knew her name even though she'd never spoken to him. Who smiled at her with eyes that made her stomach hurt. Who was getting bolder each day, coming closer, lingering longer, waiting with that patient, predatory stillness that children's instincts scream to run from. Mrs. Park had reported it to the police. 5 times. 5 times, Officer Martinez had taken notes, nodded sympathetically, and explained that without evidence of actual contact or threats, they couldn't investigate. Children have active imaginations, Mrs. Park. Sometimes they misinterpret friendly adults in the neighborhood. Has he touched her? Spoken to her directly? Made any explicit threats? Come back when something actually happens. The subtext was clear in his eyes, in his tone. A cleaner's concerns don't carry the same weight as others. Each dismissal landed heavier than the last. By the 2nd week, the watcher knew Yuna's route, her schedule, the time she walked alone. By the 3rd week, he'd started appearing at the bakery she passed, at the corner store, once impossibly near the staff housing entrance. He never touched her, never spoke, just watched, and smiled. Yuna learned to walk faster, to stay in crowds, to time her departure with other children. But some mornings, there were no other children. Some mornings, there was just her and the empty street and the man who waited like he had all the time in the world. She'd asked her mother, "Why won't the police help us?" Mrs. Park's answer had been careful, measured, wrapped in the same philosophy she'd been taught. Because people like us have to help ourselves. We can't expect the powerful to notice us. But what if I can't help myself? Her mother had no answer for that. The morning everything changed, Mrs. Park woke up feverish, dizzy, her head pounding so hard she could barely stand. But she had to work. Missing shifts meant warnings, and warnings meant termination, and termination meant. She couldn't think about what that meant. Walk fast, she told Yuna, her voice tight with pain and fear. Stay with the crowd. Don't stop for anything. But when Yuna stepped outside, backpack clutched tight, there was no crowd. Only the early morning stillness. And across the street, leaning against his usual post, the man who'd been following her for 3 weeks. Waiting. Yuna looked back at their apartment. Her mother was sick. The police wouldn't help. The school was 6 blocks away, and she was 9 years old and completely alone. Then she looked toward the main building, where 3 black sedans sat like silent sentries, where the man her mother warned her never to disturb was stepping out of his car. Yuna took a breath, and broke every rule she'd ever been taught about staying invisible. Kang walked at Yuna's pace. Slow. Deliberate. 1 measured step at a time. Behind them, his security team followed at a distance, forming a silent perimeter that moved like a single organism. Store owners paused mid-task to stare. A bus driver slowed to watch. Phones appeared in windows on street corners, in the hands of early morning commuters who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Chairman Kang Sung-ho, walking a child to school. The district had seen him at funerals where men wept and begged forgiveness. At private clubs where deals were sealed with handshakes that ended empires. At crime scenes where his arrival meant someone's time had run out. But this? This was something else entirely. Does he always stand like that? Kang asked quietly, his eyes forward. Yuna glanced back at the watcher, who'd started following at a distance. Far enough to maintain deniability, close enough to make his presence known. Yes, she said. Like he's waiting for a bus that never comes. Kang nodded once. He tapped his earpiece. Background on gray jacket, 35 to 40. Facial recognition. Now. The reply crackled instantly. Chairman, that's Han Jun-sik. Independent recruiter. Works transport routes. No fixed address. Kang's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Recruiter. The word they used when trafficker was too honest. Behind them, Han had stopped walking. He stood on the corner now, half hidden by a newspaper stand, watching this impossible scene unfold. Calculating. Recalibrating. Understanding that the child he'd been grooming for weeks had just become untouchable. They were 3 blocks from the school when Yuna spoke again. Mister, are you a bad man? Kang stopped walking. The security team halted in perfect synchronization. He crouched again, ignoring the cameras now openly filming from across the street. Ignoring the growing crowd of witnesses. Ignoring everything except the 9-year-old girl who'd asked the one question most people were too afraid to voice. I've done bad things, he said quietly. His voice was steady, honest. But I don't hurt children. Yuna studied him with that particular seriousness only children possess. The kind that sees past reputation and cuts straight to truth. My mom says scary people aren't always mean, she said. Just lonely. Something passed through Kang's eyes. Fast and sharp, like pain crossing a nerve. She's a smart woman. He stood. They walked the final blocks in silence. At the school gate, other children stared. Parents whispered. A teacher's hand froze on her coffee cup. Thank you, Mr. Kang, Yuna said, adjusting her backpack. Be safe, he replied. Then he turned and walked back through the gauntlet of witnesses, cameras, and phones capturing every frame of the most dangerous man in Seoul doing the most unexpected thing imaginable. By noon, the photos had flooded underground channels. Not mainstream news, nothing so official. But in the networks that mattered, in the channels where power was measured and territory was marked, the images spread like wildfire. Chairman Kang Sung-ho. Crouched before a child. Chairman Kang Sung-ho. Walking a little girl to school. Chairman Kang Sung-ho. Standing at a school gate like a father. The caption on every share was the same. Written in the coded language the underworld understood perfectly. This child is under my protection. No explícits. No demands. Just a simple declaration that carried the weight of absolute law. In offices, warehouses, back rooms, and private clubs across the city, men who trafficked in fear and exploitation received the message and understood its implications immediately. Han Jun-sik sat in a windowless room on the edge of the district, staring at the photos on his phone. Around him, his associates shifted uncomfortably. He embarrassed us, Han said slowly. Made it public. A younger man hesitated. Boss, it's Kang. Exactly, Han replied. His voice was calm, measured, dangerous. He thinks he owns fear. That one act of charity makes him untouchable. He set his phone down carefully. He protected one child, Han continued. But there are hundreds in this city. Thousands. He can't be everywhere. Someone in the back spoke up. What are you saying? Han smiled. The same predatory smile he'd given Yuna for 3 weeks. I'm saying Chairman Kang just declared war without realizing it. And wars require casualties. The message was clear. If Kang wanted to be a protector, they'd give him more than one child to protect. They'd see how far his mercy extended when the cost became personal. Han Jun-sik built his empire on a simple truth. Invisible people disappear quietly. For 15 years, he'd operated in the margins where law enforcement rarely looked and families rarely had the resources to fight back. Staff housing. Immigrant neighborhoods. Industrial districts where workers came and went like seasonal weather. He didn't snatch children off playgrounds in broad daylight. That was amateur work. Messy, loud, guaranteed to draw attention. No, Han understood something more fundamental. The most effective predators don't hide in shadows. They hide in plain sight, wearing patience like camouflage, waiting for the exact moment when a child was alone, when a parent was desperate, when the system had already failed so many times that one more disappearance barely registered as news. Children of cleaning staff. Children of factory workers. Children whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't afford consistent supervision. Children like Yuna Park. He'd been watching her for 3 weeks, mapping her routine, establishing familiarity. In another week, maybe 2, she would have stopped being quite so afraid. Would have accepted his presence as part of her normal landscape. Would have been vulnerable to a conversation, an offer of help, a moment of trust that could be weaponized. But then Kang Sung-ho had to play hero. Han stared at the photos circulating through the networks. Kang crouching before the girl. Kang walking her to school. Kang drawing a line in the sand with a single act of protection. He thinks he's sending a message, Han said to the men gathered in the warehouse. He thinks fear is enough. His lieutenant Min-jae leaned forward. It's Kang. For most people, fear is enough. For most people, Han agreed. But what Kang doesn't understand is that protection only works if you can be everywhere at once. And he can't. He pulled up a map on the tablet before him. Red dots scattered across the district. Each one marking a child they'd been watching, evaluating, waiting on. 12 potential acquisitions. 12 families living on the edge of invisibility. He protected one. Han continued, his finger tracing the pattern. One girl, because she had the audacity to ask and the luck to ask the right person. But what about the others? The room went quiet. Han's strategy wasn't about revenge. Revenge was emotional, reactive, the kind of thinking that got operations shut down. No, this was about leverage. About reminding Chairman Kang that moral boundaries were luxuries only the truly powerful could afford. And even then, only selectively. He wants to be a protector? Han's voice was calm, almost thoughtful. We'll show him what protection really costs. Min-jae shifted uncomfortably. You want to escalate? Against Kang? I want to educate, Han corrected. Kang built his empire on one principle. Absolute control through absolute fear. But he just revealed something more valuable than any of his territories or operations. What's that? A weakness. Han looked up from the tablet. He has a line he won't cross. Children. That makes him predictable. And predictable men can be manipulated. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. They wouldn't touch Yuna. That would be too obvious, too direct. Kang would expect that. Instead, they'd take 3 others. Children from the same invisible communities. Children whose disappearances would be reported, but not prioritized. Children whose families would be told to wait, to be patient, to trust the system that had already failed them countless times. And then they'd send Kang proof. Let him know that for every child he protected, 3 more suffered. Let him understand that his moral line didn't stop trafficking, it just redistributed the victims. He'll have to choose, Han explained. Maintain his empire and accept he can't save everyone. Or abandon his operations to play savior and watch everything he built crumble. And if he comes after us directly? Han smiled. Then we make sure the consequences fall on the children first. We make sure he understands that his protection is what put them in danger. It was psychological warfare disguised as business strategy. Kang would be forced to confront the fundamental truth that Han had understood for years. You can't save everyone. You can't be everywhere. And the moment you try, you expose everyone around you to the enemies you've made. Min-jae pulled out his phone. When do we start? Han looked at the photos of Kang and Yuna one more time. Tonight, he said quietly. While Kang is still celebrating his good deed, we'll remind him what good deeds actually cost. He closed the tablet. And we'll send him proof in the morning. The package arrived at noon. No return address. No courier name. Just a plain brown envelope left at the front desk of Kang's primary office, delivered during the precise 15-minute window when security rotations changed. Professional. Calculated. A message in itself. Kang's lieutenant brought it to him without opening it. Something in the wait, the silence around its arrival, suggested this wasn't routine correspondence. Kang opened it at his desk alone. Inside were 4 photographs. The first 3 showed children. Elementary school age. 2 boys, 1 girl. Playground backgrounds. School uniforms. Candid shots taken from a distance with telephoto precision. Around each face, someone had drawn a red circle in marker, deliberate, careful, like targeting reticles. Kang's hand didn't shake. His expression didn't change. But something in the room's temperature seemed to drop. The 4th photograph was different. Yuna. School portrait. Her smile bright and innocent, unaware of the camera's real purpose. Beneath her face, a red line had been drawn. Not a circle. A line. Like underlining a name on a list. A handwritten note lay at the bottom of the envelope. You protect one. We collect others. You can't be everywhere. Choose carefully. Kong sat motionless for a long time. Not reading. Not thinking. Just absorbing the weight of what had been laid before him. His lieutenant entered without knocking. A privilege earned over a decade of service. Sir. Kong slid the photographs across the desk. The lieutenant's face went pale. When? Sometime in the last 24 hours. Kang's voice was quiet. Controlled. Probably last night. This is provocation. Direct challenge. The lieutenant's hand curled into a fist. If we respond with force, it becomes war, Kong finished. I know. And if we don't respond, they keep taking children. The lieutenant leaned forward. Sir, with respect, you can't protect everyone. That's what they want you to think. That you're responsible for every. I am responsible. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Kong stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the district. Somewhere down there, 3 children were going about their day, unaware that their faces were in a predator's files, that they'd been marked, circled, targeted, because of him, because he'd made Yuna visible. You made one girl safe, the lieutenant said carefully. That's not a crime. And 3 others became targets because of it. You don't know that. Kong turned. His eyes were cold, clear, absolutely certain. Yes. Ido. The philosophy of power he'd built his empire on was simple. Control through fear, distance through reputation, strength through decisive action. But that philosophy assumed you didn't care about collateral damage. That you could draw lines around what mattered and let everything outside those lines burn. He'd drawn that line at children. And now Han Jun-sik was showing him exactly what that line cost. What do you want to do? The lieutenant asked. Kong looked at the photographs again. 3 children he didn't know. One he'd walked to school yesterday morning. All 4 now connected by a thread of accountability he couldn't ignore. Lock down the building, he said quietly. Double coverage on Yuna and her mother. Quietly. No visibles que laschen. That's defensive. They'll see it as weakness. Let them. Sir. They think this is leverage, Kong interrupted. His voice remained calm, but something underneath it had shifted. Hardened into something that transcended anger. They think I'll choose between my empire and these children. That I'll calculate the cost and decide it's not worth it. He picked up the photograph of Yuna. Looked at her smile. Her innocence. The trust she'd placed in him when she had no reason to trust anyone. They're wrong. The lieutenant waited. Find them, Kong said. Every watcher. Every safe house. Every connection to Han's network. I want locations by tonight. And then we remind this city what happens when people mistake restraint for weakness. Kong set the photo down carefully. Han thinks he's starting a war. He's not. He looked up, and his eyes carried the weight of a decision that couldn't be unmade. He's starting accountability. The lieutenant nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without further words. Outside, the city continued its rhythm. Unaware that the man who'd built an empire on silence and fear had just decided to break his own rules. Not for revenge. Not for reputation. But for 4 children in photographs, and every invisible child those 4 represented. Han wanted to force a choice. Kong had made one. The first call came at 8:47 p.m. A night guard at a bus depot. Older man, voice shaking slightly, speaking quickly like he might lose courage if he slowed down. I saw the photos, he said. The chairman. Walking that girl. I think I know something. Kang's communication team had been fielding calls all evening, mostly threats, some support, many just curious. But this one was different. This one had weight. A van, the guard continued. Gray panel van. Comes twice a week. Parks in the back lot for exactly 40 minutes. Driver never gets out. Always between 2 and 3 a.m. I wouldn't have noticed, but I have a granddaughter. Same age as that girl. The address was logged. Verified. Added to a growing map. The second call came 20 minutes later. A convenience store cashier. Young woman. Night shift worker who saw everything and was trained to see nothing. There's a man who comes in every Thursday, she said. Her voice was steadier, angrier. Buys cigarettes and energy drinks. Always pays cash. Has photos on his phone. I saw them once when he was scrolling. Children. School photos. He didn't know I noticed. She gave a description. A license plate number she'd memorized weeks ago, not knowing what to do with it. I'm tired of being afraid, she said before hanging up. And I'm tired of watching other people be afraid too. By 10 p.m., the calls kept coming. A janitor who'd seen suspicious activity behind an abandoned warehouse. A taxi driver who'd picked up a fare that gave him an address where children's voices came from basements. A delivery worker who'd noticed bars on windows where bars shouldn't be. A teacher who'd watched a man photograph her students during recess. People who lived in the margins. People who cleaned offices after dark. People who drove buses and stocked shelves and worked security in buildings that the powerful never looked at twice. People who'd been invisible their entire lives. They called because they'd seen something impossible. A 9-year-old girl asking the most dangerous man in Seoul for help. And that man saying yes. If she could speak, maybe they could too. Kong stood in his operations room, watching the map fill with locations. Red pins multiplying across the district like stars emerging at dusk. Each one a tip. A sighting. A piece of intelligence that individually meant nothing, but collectively painted a picture of an entire network. This is unprecedented, his lieutenant said, staring at the board. We've never had civilian cooperation like this. They're not cooperating with us, Kong replied quietly. They're cooperating with each other. Because the calls weren't just information drops. People were calling to coordinate. To compare notes. A bus driver remembered seeing the gray van the guard mentioned. A shop owner recognized the man the cashier described. A construction worker had seen suspicious renovations at one of the addresses. They were building their own network. One conversation, one observation, one shared piece of courage at a time. Mrs. Park called at 11:30 p.m. Her voice was small but clear. Chairman Kong? It's Yuna's mother. Mrs. Park. I wanted to say, she paused, gathering words that had been suppressed for years. Thank you. For walking her. For seeing her when no one else would. She was brave, Kong said. She learned it from watching you. Mrs. Park's voice strengthened. And I know things too. About the staff housing. About men who watch us. Who know our schedules. I never said anything because I thought no one would care. I'm listening now. She told him about patterns she'd noticed. Vehicles that didn't belong. Faces that appeared too regularly. Conversations that stopped when cleaners entered rooms. We see everything, she said. We're just trained to pretend we don't. By 2 a.m., the map had transformed. 3 confirmed safe houses. 2 vehicle registrations. 4 names. 7 interconnected locations that formed a web across the district's industrial edge. And at the center, a warehouse registered to a shell company that didn't exist, in a neighborhood where no one asked questions because questions were expensive. Kang's team cross-referenced property records, surveillance footage, utility usage patterns. Everything aligned. The lieutenant checked his watch. We move at dawn. No. Kong studied the map, seeing not just locations but faces. The guard. The cashier. The janitor. Mrs. Park. Ordinary people who'd spent their lives being invisible, who'd chosen tonight to be seen. We move now, he said. While they still think we're deciding. While they still believe we'll choose empire over accountability. He turned to his team. Coordinate with the authorities. I want this clean, documented, legal. No dos evidencias. No sados. We do this in the light. Because Han had miscalculated. He'd thought Kang's protection was a lone gesture. One powerful man shielding one lucky child. He hadn't understood that courage spreads like fire. That one girl's question could ignite a district. That invisible people, once they start speaking, become impossible to ignore. Outside, the city was still dark. But dawn was coming. And with it, accountability. The operation began at 3:47 a.m. Not with gunfire or dramatic confrontations, but with phone calls. Coordinated. Systematic. Deliberate. Kang's team had spent the last hour compiling evidence that couldn't be ignored. Surveillance footage, witness statements, vehicle registrations, financial records connecting Han's network to properties across the district. Everything documented. Everything admissible. The first call went to Detective Choi, a mid-level investigator who'd spent 15 years watching cases like this go nowhere for lack of evidence or political will. "This is Chairman Kang," came the voice on the line. "I'm sending you files on a trafficking operation. 3 children taken in the last 24 hours. I have locations, names, and civilian witnesses ready to testify." Choi hesitated. "Chairman, with respect, this isn't." "I know what it isn't," Kang interrupted. "This isn't backroom justice. This isn't territory dispute. This is by-the-book law enforcement, and I'm handing you everything you need to make it stick." Silence on the line. "Why?" Choi finally asked. "Because this time, the evidence speaks for itself. You just have to listen." The files arrived 90 seconds later. Choi opened them, scrolled through page after page of documentation that would have taken his department weeks to compile, and understood immediately. Kang wasn't offering assistance. He was removing every excuse. The second call went to Captain Park at the precinct, who'd dismissed Mrs. Park's reports 5 times. This call was shorter. "You have 3 missing children, and a warehouse full of evidence waiting for you. You can be there when we recover them, or you can explain tomorrow why you weren't." By 4:15 a.m., 5 police units were mobilizing. Not because they wanted to help Kang, but because the documentation was airtight, the witnesses were ready, and the pressure from a district that had suddenly found its voice made inaction impossible. The warehouse was industrial. Isolated. Windows barred, entrances limited. The kind of place designed to hide things. Kang's team arrived first, establishing perimeter. Not to breach, to contain. When the police rolled up 6 minutes later, they found a quiet scene. No drama. No spectacle. Just professionals doing professional work. Buildings locked down. Kang's lieutenant reported to Detective Choi. 2 exits, both covered. "We haven't entered. It's yours." Choi studied him with open suspicion. "You're just giving this to us?" "This was never about territory," Kang replied. "It was about accountability." The breach was textbook. Police entering with warrants, cameras rolling, everything documented. No sados. No shortcuts. Every action defensible in court. They found the children in a storage room on the 2nd floor. 2 boys, 1 girl. Scared but unharmed. Taken less than 18 hours ago, held until arrangements could be made. Until parents became desperate enough to stop asking questions. The youngest was 7. Paramedics moved in immediately. Social workers. A system that had failed these children a dozen times suddenly snapping into efficient action because this time, someone had forced them to show up. Han Jun-sik wasn't in the warehouse. He was at the port, waiting for a cargo ship that would depart at dawn. His exit strategy had been planned months ago. Quiet disappearance, new identity, a network that continued operating without him. But the port security guard, the same one who'd called about the gray van, recognized him from the description circulating through the district. 1 phone call. 2 police units diverted. Han was arrested trying to board at 5:23 a.m., his escape route blocked by the very invisibility he'd exploited for years. The workers he'd ignored. The guards he'd dismissed. The people he'd counted on staying silent. They'd stopped staying silent. By 6 a.m. it was over. 3 children recovered. Han in custody. 4 safe houses raided. 7 associates arrested. Documentation so thorough that prosecutors were already talking about trials, not plea deals. The kind of closure that almost never happened. Detective Choi found Kang outside the warehouse as dawn broke over the district. "This is going to make headlines," Choi said. "Chairman Kang brings down trafficking ring. Cooperation between underworld and law enforcement." It's not my story," Kang interrupted. Choi blinked. "Sir, the story is that a 9-year-old girl asked for help, and a district full of invisible people decided to be seen." Kang turned toward his car. Everything else is just consequence. Your reputation doesn't matter. His lieutenant approached with an update. Sir, the families are asking to thank you personally. There's already talk of a press conference, community gathering. No. The word was final. Kong looked back at the warehouse, where children were being reunited with parents, where mothers cried and investigators documented, and a system that normally moved in slow motion suddenly functioned the way it was designed to. We don't celebrate, he said quietly. We just made the world work the way it should have been working all along. He got in his car, because this wasn't about glory or redemption or transforming his reputation. It was about a debt he could never fully repay. And debts weren't settled with applause. They were settled with action. The next morning, Chairman Kong returned to the school. Not in black sedans with security perimeters. Not with the deliberate theater of power that usually announced his presence. He walked. Alone. The same 6 blocks Yuna traveled every day. Past the bakery where the watcher used to wait. Past the corner store where mothers bought lunch supplies on stretched budgets. Past the lamp post where Han had leaned with predatory patience. Parents noticed him immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Hands tightened on children's backpacks. The instinct was still there. The reflex to look away, stay invisible, pretend not to see. But Kong stopped at the school gate and waited. Not commanding. Not demanding. Just present. Mrs. Park arrived with Yuna. Her uniform replaced with regular clothes for the first time anyone could remember. She'd taken the morning off. Not called in sick. Not made excuses. Just asked. And been granted it without question. When she saw Kong, she stopped walking. Mrs. Park, he said quietly. May I speak with you? And the others? The question hung in the air like an offering. Other parents had gathered now. Watching. Waiting. The cleaning staff, the bus drivers, the shop workers, people who'd spent years learning to be invisible, suddenly being asked instead of commanded. Mrs. Park looked at her daughter. Yuna nodded. Yes, Mrs. Park said. Her voice was steady. You may. Kong crouched then. The same gesture he'd made 3 days ago when Yuna first approached him. But this time, it wasn't for a child. He lowered himself until he was at eye level with the circle of parents, dropping the physical authority that height and reputation provided, making himself equal, making himself accountable. I came to make a promise, he said. The street had gone completely silent. What happened this week, what almost happened, should never have occurred in the first place. Your children should have been safe without needing to ask someone like me for protection. A father in work coveralls shifted his weight. But they weren't. No, Kong agreed. They weren't. And that's a failure of systems that should protect everyone, not just those who can demand attention. He looked at Mrs. Park directly. You reported the threat 5 times. 5 times you were dismissed. That ends now. How? Another mother asked, her voice tight with years of disappointment. How does anything change? Because you're not invisible anymore, Kong replied. This district saw what happened when one child spoke. When invisible people decided to be seen. You built a network in 24 hours that law enforcement couldn't build in years. He stood slowly, his gaze moving across the gathered faces. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust each other. Keep watching. Keep speaking. Keep refusing to be ignored. His voice carried across the quiet street. And if the system fails you again, I'll make sure there are consequences for that failure. It wasn't mercy. It wasn't charity. It was accountability wearing a new face. Mrs. Park spoke then, her voice clear and deliberate. We've been afraid for so long. Afraid to ask. Afraid to demand. Afraid that speaking would cost us everything. It might, Kong said honestly. But silence cost you more. She nodded slowly. Then we speak. Other heads nodded. Agreements rippling through the crowd like courage finding purchase. The school bell rang. Children started moving toward the gate, and parents followed, not scattered and hurried, but together. A community that had always existed but had never believed it could be seen. Yuna tugged Kang's sleeve before entering. Mr. Kong. She looked up at him with those serious 9-year-old eyes. Are you still scary? He considered the question with the gravity it deserved. Yes, he said finally. But maybe not to the people who shouldn't be afraid. She thought about that, then smiled. Good. She walked through the gate. And Chairman Kang Sung-ho, the man whose name made politicians hesitate and criminals calculate, watched her go, understanding that power without purpose was just noise. That protection without accountability was just control. That sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was kneel down and listen when someone asked for help. Behind him, Mrs. Park spoke once more. Will you walk her home too? Kang turned. If she asks. She will, Mrs. Park said. Then quieter. We all will. The street had changed. Not through force or fear or the architecture of power, but through one girl's question and a district's decision that invisible people deserve to be seen. 3 months later, Yuna walked to school surrounded by voices. Not bodyguards. Not security details. Just other children. Other parents. A neighborhood that had learned to move together instead of separately. The gray van never returned. The lamppost where Han used to wait became a meeting point for morning carpools. The bakery started opening earlier to accommodate the new traffic. Families walking in groups, visible and deliberate. The district had rewritten itself. Chairman Kang watched from his office window most mornings, coffee growing cold in his hand. He didn't walk Yuna to school anymore. Didn't need to. The community had taken that role for themselves. His lieutenant found him there one morning, staring at the street below where children laughed and parents coordinated schedules without fear shading their voices. The trafficking arrests held, the lieutenant reported. Han and 6 associates. 20-year sentences. The prosecutor said it was the most airtight case she'd seen in a decade. Kang nodded but didn't look away from the window. There's also been interest, the lieutenant continued carefully. Other districts. Other communities asking how this happened. How invisible people became organized. They were always organized, Kang said quietly. They just needed someone to see them first. They needed you to see them. Kang finally turned. No. They needed Yuna to be brave enough to ask. Everything else was just consequence. His empire hadn't crumbled. The operations continued. The territory remained. But something fundamental had shifted in how he wielded power. Not as a weapon to inspire fear, but as a resource to create space for people who'd never had it. The difference was subtle but absolute. Mrs. Park had become a community organizer without meaning to. She coordinated safety schedules, shared information, connected parents across buildings and blocks. The network that had formed during one desperate night had solidified into something permanent. Other staff members spoke openly now, reported concerns, demanded accountability, and were heard. Not because systems suddenly became compassionate, but because invisibility had become expensive. Because the district had learned that silence protected predators more than it protected anyone else. Kang received weekly reports now. Not about territory or rivals, but about families, children, patterns that might indicate danger before it solidified into tragedy. He funded after-school programs quietly, ensured security patrols extended into neighborhoods that had previously been ignored, made it known through carefully placed words that children in his district were under collective protection. Not his protection alone. Everyone's. One afternoon, he encountered Yuna outside the staff housing. She was playing with 3 other children. The same ones whose photographs had arrived in that brown envelope. Targeted, then saved, now just children. Hello, Mr. Kang. Yuna said, still formal but no longer afraid. Yuna. He nodded to the others. Are you all staying safe? We walk together now. One of the boys volunteered. My dad says that's the rule. Nobody walks alone. That's a good rule. Yuna studied him with that particular seriousness she possessed. My mom says you're different now. That you're still scary but scary in a good way. What do you think? Kang asked. She considered this carefully. I think you're like the crosswalk guard. You stop the bad cars so the rest of us can cross safely. The simplicity of it struck him harder than any threat or negotiation ever had. That's exactly right, he said. She smiled and returned to her game. Kang walked away understanding something he'd spent decades missing. Power wasn't about how much fear you could generate or how much control you could maintain. Power was about what you chose to do with it when someone vulnerable enough to need help was brave enough to ask. The district had changed because one child refused to disappear. Because one mother kept reporting even when dismissed. Because invisible people chose to speak when silence had always been safer. Kong hadn't saved them. They'd saved themselves. He'd just been the first person powerful enough to listen. Years from now, when people told this story, they'd probably get it wrong. They'd say Chairman Kong reformed. That he became a hero. That one good deed redeemed a violent legacy. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. He'd been asked a question by someone who had no right to expect an answer. And he'd chosen not to look away. Everything else was just people realizing they didn't have to be invisible anymore. Courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's just a child asking the wrong man for help. And choosing not to disappear. Thanks so much, my dear friends, for enjoying this beautiful story till this end. If you've not subscribed, kindly subscribe now to be notified when we drop our next story. Also, like the video and comment where you are watching from and what time it's at your end up. Thank you.